This episode was brought to you by Slate Black Industries. For M-Lock grips and accessories, visit slateBlackIndustries.com.
One pack, green, over. At the top, 16, roger, over. I think 1692.
Welcome to Pick 1, a mental exercise brought to you by 9-Hole Reviews. In each Pick One episode, we deliberately ask you to choose between two options with opposing weapon systems and give you a scenario to mentally put yourself into. We publish this scenario and options on all of our social media pages about a week before our live discussion segment for members and audience to comment and, most importantly, to vote on the poll. During our live Pick One segment, we will discuss the scenario in our 4-part live discussion. Part 1, a review of the scenario and options. Part 2, we discuss our choices and why. Part 3, we discuss comments that stood out to us. And finally, Part 4, we open the forum to any viewer that's present to join us in the live chat. Now, to start this week's Pick One exercise, this is a recap from our previously published scenario brief. So it's been a few years, since 2077, in the formerly known as Las Vegas, Nevada area. The world has forever changed since those nukes fell. What was once a vibrant world of suburbs, restaurants, and supermarkets are now full of roving merchants defending themselves and their pack animals against bandits on the trade routes, drug manufacturing operations, and irradiated feral animals, and no real government. This world, it's now just civilians trying to make a living in constant armed skirmishes between pseudo-governments, ranging between California and New Vegas, and in the desert in between. But something happened one day, and honestly, even though you don't remember, you know something knocked you out. But you don't even remember your own name. Now, luckily, there was a town doctor and some locals who discovered you and helped you recover from your wounds. But outside of that, you only find a note in your pocket that indicates that you've got to travel back to New Vegas to find somebody who knows. Now, New Vegas is about 100 plus miles away, and on foot. It should be noted that fossil fuel vehicles don't work anymore. Rubber tires and parts have all degraded, and gasoline and petrol just doesn't exist anymore. Your 2 feet are your only mode of transportation. Legacy Kevlar, synthetic materials alike, those are all degraded. Most of your opponents out there would be wearing metal armor, leather armor, and on top of that, massive nuclear drops mutated some of those animals that still roam the desert these days. Now, before you leave, the doctor offers you something to protect yourself with. Now, these belong to his son, who was formerly the town's militia member, and ever since he died, he really hasn't had much use for them. But the doctor has kept them well maintained and oiled, and the ammunition in a nice, dry place. You don't want to take everything that he has, though. After all, he is a good Samaritan. So pick wisely. You may have to be using these things for the years to come. Option number 1. A bolt-action surplus rifle with a low-power 3.5 scope on it. 8 rounds of ammunition to go with this, plus a suppressed .22 pistol. Now you have 29 rounds that come with this. Option number 2. a Chinese Type 56 Kalashnikov with 27 rounds in the magazine. So what would you choose? The bolt-action surplus rifle with a low-powered scope plus a suppressed .22 pistol? Or would it be the Kalashnikov? Let us know in the comments section.
Право. Есть загорание двух крайних диодов центральных.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for attending the 5th episode of Pick 1, brought to you by Slate Black Industries. My name is Henry. I am your co-host off of 9 Hole Reviews. We have here Josh.
What's happening, gang? Good to see everybody back for the stream. And to introduce our guest for tonight, Henry.
Tonight's guest comes from InRange TV. Mr. Karl actually lives in the wasteland and has lived in the wasteland for quite a while. Not only is he well versed in the ways of the wasteland, which hopefully he'll talk about the story of his car battery, but Karl also is very well acclimated to the weather out there and a lot of characteristics of how the weapon systems perform out there. So, Karl? Oh.
There you go. Thank you.
Sorry.
Hey. Hello, everyone out there, and I appreciate your great introduction and having me along for this Pick 1. This is a very cool project. I've enjoyed it for all the episodes you've put out, and this lends itself to a very interesting conversation. A lot of people think that it's a conversation about the Fallout universe, and it is, but really it's a reflection of reality, because the Fallout universe is a question of survivalism and what weapons would work in an environment like that. And I think that this particular discussion dovetails in a very interesting way to not only the game universe, but reality.
So that's a good way to start this conversation. For those who are unaware, Fallout is a video game series based on the collapse of civilization post-2077, when in the game, China and the US were fighting a war for quite a while. Unfortunately, ending in nuclear strikes that turned the world in, and I quote from the game, a nuclear wasteland. And so in this post-apocalyptic world, there's a lot of lore, there's a lot of theories of what would happen to civilization, mankind, and then on the very micro scale, how would you survive this type of environment? How would you navigate through this new world order of really not having any big government, and most of the world works on a very small scales communities interacting with one another. So while on the surface, we're talking about the structure and story based off of a video game series, really the topic that we're trying to tackle is an age-old topic that a lot of us in the American firearms community have spent countless evenings, I would say, after going to the range with our friends debating, if the world fell apart, if none of this structure existed anymore, would you rather use a bolt action or a Kalashnikov, or in other terms, in other thoughts, an AR versus a Kalashnikov, a suppressed .22? Right here, what we're looking at are the 3 classic quote-unquote survivalist weapons. The bolt-action surplus rifle with a scope, whether that's a proper Mosin PU factory installed, or let's say a variable skilled gunsmith civilian installation. There are terms to describe that I will brush over. Or would you choose the Kalashnikov, a variation of a service rifle that has been used in the past, that is semi-passe, not entirely passe like the bolt-action rifle? So that is the core of the question that we're talking about, and we're deliberately putting this scenario into the desert wasteland scenario some years after the nuclear strikes. Now, I deliberately did not put the time frame on this because Karl and I, well, Josh, Karl, and I actually had this discussion quite a bit, because as Karl eloquently put it earlier in our private discussion, you leave things long enough and everything devolves away from metallic cartridges and things that we can manufacture nowadays. So, Karl, tell us what that means, and that will drive us into the assumption that we have as a baseline.
Yeah, right. Yeah, totally. So this is one of the things that I think you see so much in any type of apocalyptic or science fiction fantasy world, whether it's Fallout or anything else. Pick one. All of them. Pick one. Interesting. But the reality is all of these sci-fi worlds and have these post-apocalyptic scenarios always show people scrounging for like an AKM or a Mosin or whatever and finding ammunition for it. And that would work for a while. But I think that you can look at just the recent events, even our own history here in the US, just over the last year. Going to the local store just to get ammunition when there's a supply chain is a problem. Imagine when there isn't a supply chain and you're now scrounging for ammunition. The reality is that's going to last a very short duration of time unless you're particularly lucky. And the thing that's left out of all of these discussions is that we would really ultimately devolve back to flintlocks and matchlocks, because those are things you can keep running as long as you can find rocks and powder. But that, for some reason, is never part of the conversation. And I think that's because either people aren't familiar with those types of weapons or just don't want to deal with stuff that antiquated. But ultimately, that's where we would land up.
Yeah, so the past year and a half, I think, was a very good experiment on just a taste of that when we had difficulty with supply chain issues, right? A lot of people in the past have always said, oh, I can reload, so I can make whatever I want. But no, when you lose contact with manufacturers making the powder and components and projectiles, that is no longer true. So to expand on what Karl was saying, you can mix black powder. I mean, quality-wise depends on you and the equipment that you have, right? And as far as a flintlock blunderbuss, literally, I mean, it's brilliant because you just push the powder and stick rocks in it with some kind of wadding material, if I'm not mistaken, and that itself fires. But anyways,
I was going to say there, Henry, if I could jump in on that for a second. When you talked about the blunderbuss, I actually have a pretty extensive amount of videos about that. If you can find powder and you can find rocks and you can find a bush to pull some leaves off of to keep that all wedged in there, and you can get a spark to the charge, you can fire the gun. You don't even need necessarily to have a flint. You could use a lighter. Of course, we're getting more and more crude here, but that's where things would ultimately go, I think. And do not do this at home. Black powder guns are designed to fire black powder, but you could use other propellant too in a pinch. And we're talking about a post-apocalyptic world where you're scrounging for anything.
Right. So to veer us back to the conversation of today's pick one, if we were to really mince into the topic, we would end up at the point of which model of blunderbuss would you like to make, right? But without having to get to that point, let's just proceed with an assumption that there are small pockets of ammunition supplies around, which is why these weapons are still viable and which is why the doctor still has limited small amounts of ammunition there. And we have to proceed with this type of assumption. Otherwise, the entire pick one would not make any sense. And we'd be going back to blunderbusses, and bow and arrow and spears and sabers. So with that said, I could start us off with the, let's see. I will start us off with the scenario review of pick 1. I'll start us off with the MET-TC analysis, as I usually do. For those who are unaware, MET-TC is an acronym that most U.S. military officers and NCOs use to analyze a scenario so they could better plan and better react to certain situations or to certain missions that are handed down to them. Now, MET-TC stands for Mission, Enemy, Terrain, Troops Available, Time, and Civilian Considerations. Those are typically the 6 items that go through your mind as a military officer if you have to quickly deal with a scenario or a situation. So the mission in this sense, we're trying to travel 100, was it miles or kilometers that I quoted? A long distance.
I think we said it was miles.
100 miles on foot. So it's a very long distance. It's about 1,600 1.6 kilometers. Wait, no, 160 kilometers. So it's a long distance to travel on foot. You're talking about a sparse, very open field location, and you're trying to trek your way back into civilization from one small settlement back to New Vegas itself. Now, if we were to look at the enemy, let's open up the intelligence right now, actually. Sorry, I didn't mean to go straight to the enemy side. So this is what this world, this brave new world looks like. It is juxtaposed on the continental United States, so we could sort of see what we're looking at as far as factions that are around. And these are very loose factions. These are not very densely populated areas with a lot of these factions around. The NCR is a new California republic. This is a better map of it. What that means, this was in the game, and I'm using the game mechanics because we can't predict the future and what happens, and this is the best we can come up with a fictional enemy to really look at. The NCR is a quasi-democratic republic that somewhat resembles what we see right now as a United States. It is mirrored the United States, but it is poorly mirrored to the United States, except for one thing, is that they like to tax people. Well, I guess another thing is they use their taxes to fund a somewhat succinct military to defend their borders. And so what happened in this fictional world, these factions called Caesar's Legion in the four corner states manifested on the border of the NCR. Now, smack in between, we have Pheasany. I don't know why it's called Pheasany, but this is the New Vegas area. New Vegas, there's the Hoover Dam right there that is able to generate electricity, which is a natural resource that both sides want. Caesar's Legion is a somewhat religious organization that has very disciplined and motivated ground troops, but pattern themselves after the Roman Empire. I know this sounds crazy. Just go with it. And we'll go with it a little bit more in a bit as far as that. So this is somewhat what we're looking at in the southwestern terrain of what we know as the southwestern United States area. Karl, I believe you are somewhere around, no, that's New Mexico. So you are somewhere around here. So right on the western border of Caesar's Legion and very close to the disputed land that we're trying to travel through, which puts Karl exactly in the location of the conflict where we are. Now, what does the terrain look like in this area? Arid, wide open lands. There are some hills, some elevation. Riverbeds are sparse. You do have some vegetation, but not very useful for survival's sake. Some settlements, some old settlements that you may run into. And as you can see right here, very wide open fields, desert arid type terrain. And so, Karl, you actually are out there, by the way. I mean, how do these pictures reflect your area?
No, it's actually quite accurately and well done. First of all, some of those were real photos and some of those are in game, but I think it does represent it. One of the things that there's a big difference, though, between the Sonoran Desert, which is where Tucson would be, or Tucson, and New Vegas, and west of that, the Mojave. The Mojave is definitely a different ecological system. It still has mountains, rocks, and a lot of terrain that has, believe it or not, more difference in elevation and things that would allow you to be undetectable if you know what you're doing in these environments. The Sonoran Desert, which is where you were pointing out about my area, is more lush, more green, has more water than the Mojave, and more mountainous terrain. So as you're moving from the east to the west, or through to or towards New Vegas, you would have more cover, actually more water, which is hard to believe, and probably be able to be more undetected. Now, in that regard, either one of these environments, even the Mojave, which is very much moon-like in terms of its surface area, if someone doesn't want to be seen, you pretty much, if you know what you're doing and aren't walking in an open desert plain, you can go without being seen. So detectability is still challenging if fieldcraft is in play. And for people that have too much bravado and don't worry about fieldcraft, yeah, you can see very long distances, but detecting a human being past 300 yards that doesn't want to be seen is an unlikely scenario. You know what? Let me go back one more thing. When you think about a lot of this is very interesting and how much it still ties back into scenarios and the wars that happened here in the, quote, Old West, when the cavalry was out here attempting to, squelch the rebellion of the indigenous people like the Apache, Nday, etc. They were pretty much unfindable. When the Apache didn't want to be found, they weren't, but they would find you, and that's fieldcraft, and this environment still makes that possible. So I would think that a wastelander who's been around long enough would have some of that under their belt.
So when the Apache back in the day tried to hide in this type of terrain, what would they do? I'm guessing the mountain crevasses, would they use the vegetation to their advantage?
All of the above. In fact, there's an area down near Tombstone that's called Cochise Stronghold. And the reason for that is that the mountainous terrain and the boulders and all the things that are there is just one little wash or one little canyon after another. And each and every one of them was a death sentence if you tried to walk through it, because they would wait behind things, behind a rock, under a rock, in a crevasse, in a wash. And as you went by, they would come up and get you from behind. There's actually stories, not apocryphal ones, at least a couple of them that are absolutely verified, in which some Apache warriors disappeared out of plain sight where there was no cover and no terrain, and they had actually dug themselves into the sand and were using some sort of like straw from a natural plant in the area to breathe. And people would walk past them within a couple feet and be ambushed by them. There was a female warrior named Lozen who did that to escape Spanish soldiers. She literally buried herself in sand and was breathing through an Ocotillo tube and got away, but it was also used as a warfare technique. So it is possible to disappear even in just open sand.
Oh, wow. Okay. I mean, that makes me think of, back in the day, growing up in the Far East, the ninjas were always there was a scene of the ninja underwater with a little pipe, a little straw sticking out, and that's how they were hiding in plain sight. And then to sneak out, and they were spies back in the Japanese days. So I did not know that about the Apaches. So interesting thing. This is actually this real life photo. This is actually Afghanistan. This is actually Bagram. I took this from the airfield, and sort of what you were talking about. The Afghans were able to, through the years, use a lot of the terrain in a very similar manner. I mean, for instance, it took us how long to find bin Laden in the caves? And they use the same tactics to hit the Soviets. Use the same tactics to hit us. So it's actually interesting that you talk about even the Apaches back in the day were using that's pretty extreme to hide in the desert with a straw. Okay.
Yeah, there's more than one story of that. There's actual accounts, and in fact, there's accounts where one of the accounts is where because there were Apache scouts as well that were on the American side of the conflict, at least during certain durations of the war. And there was one in which one of the officers was like, "Can you show this to me?" And I can get you this story for another day, but the warrior was like, "Sure." And he gave him a few seconds, or a couple minutes, turned around, and he said the guy couldn't find him, completely disappeared, and walked around looking for him. And the guy just popped up out of the sand. He's like, "Hey, here I am," literally like feet away from him. So that kind of fieldcraft is a real thing. And you don't even need that level of fieldcraft out in the desert here, like you mentioned when you talk about Afghanistan. And interestingly, that picture, I don't recognize that mountain range, and I would not have known that was per se Afghanistan, but the mountain range just north of my house looks pretty much identical to this. So in that regard, if you get out to that terrain, just the foothills of it, and you don't crest yourself on the mountain, but use the military crest, you can move without being seen quite easily.
The interesting thing you talk about military crest. I didn't expect you to really, delve into these things. But on that note, we could progress towards the wildlife portion of this. These are from the in-game pictures, and
really? Are they in-game pictures, Henry?
Yeah, they're not real. I mean, I know the CGI is fantastic, circa 2005 probably, but point is, some of the animals during this time frame had some type of strange mutations, and this is what in the game called Yao Guai. Is actually a bear that's mutated. You can see it looks like a bear right here. And that's actually a fun fact. It's the Chinese word for monster. So I wanted to put that out there, that there is wildlife out there, even though you're in the desert. That's
the case now, right? We're not that irradiated here, but there is a lot of wildlife out here in the desert. The desert's a very hostile place, not necessarily from a bear, but when you walk out here, there's any multitude of thing can get you in the Sonoran or the Mojave Desert. And when there are people that visit that don't normally live here, my advice is touch nothing. Literally just touch nothing, because the plants will get you. And if the plant doesn't get you and you start doing stupid things like picking up rocks, you'll find yourself a rattlesnake or a bark scorpion. And those can truly mess you up. So on top of that, there's javelina that will protect their young. There are bears in the mountains. There's coyotes, there's foxes. There's a lot of stuff out here. And of course, in the Fallout universe, we're dealing with animals that have been messed up by nuclear radiation. I mean, when you talk about Chernobyl, they're not necessarily mutated, but the wolves of Chernobyl are somewhat famous and quite dangerous.
I've actually been to Chernobyl and seen some of the animals, but it's the interesting thing about that the Chernobyl, especially the predators. It sounds really bad, but the tourists have been feeding them a lot. So a lot of those animals now they look some of them look sickly, but they have somewhat they have a dependency on the tourism that goes through Chernobyl nowadays, which is kind of sad. The one thing that I remember when I used to go hunting in the desert all the time is one day we heard a mountain lion crying down in South Texas. And it sounded, first of all, a mountain lion, if you ever heard it cry, it sounds like a woman screaming in the middle of the desert. I don't know how else to explain it, but it is creepy. Because at first, to the uninitiated, you think there's a woman screaming in the middle of the desert. But then we went to go look for it, and their paws are pretty darn big. I mean, if you really try to imagine how big it was, I remember putting my palm on it. It's about around the size of my palm, and my friends were telling me that's not full grown too. So. Okay, so the one part I wanted to bring up were the factions, and again, these are based off of video game stuff. Just because in real life, this never happened. So just for conversation purpose, so we have a government and an opposing government, a force opposing to the government, right? So would be the government force. They largely use a lot of tech that was derived from the old world. It is a somewhat democratic society. These are their ground troops. So these are New Californian Republic troops, and they have a somewhat standardized type of issue. A lot of their income is based off of trade, and their government heavily taxes them to support this type of military activity out east of them, since they're westbound. The other side, on the factions, you have a cult-like organization called Caesar's Legion. And the interesting thing is these guys basically, it's a totalitarian society. And from far away, you would think, wow, these guys look like Roman soldiers back in the day with firearms. But if you look very closely, most of their armor comes from, it's like hockey armor and football helmets and bike helmets put together to make it look like the Roman legion. And a lot of these guys are in top physical shape, probably not this gentleman on the left side, but a lot of these guys are in top physical shape, and they adhere to a very strict and extreme moral code that pushes them beyond what the New Californian Republic soldiers and citizens and some of the wastelanders are used to include slavery and what we would today perceive as just not so nice politics towards women, and different ways of keeping a society that was more akin to, let's say, even the ancient days of our current society that we're used to. Let's see. And then on top of that, understand there are remnants of some groups that have seized old US military equipment. And these are exoskeleton mech suits that you could somewhat find out there in the wasteland, but largely very limited because of the amount of technological prowess that you would need to maintain these types of suits and learn to use them. And then the other piece of the technology, prior to the society's collapse, there was massive use of drone technology to provide security for the local region. So every now and then you could run into some of these security drones. Gents, you have anything to add towards that?
No, only that there's like, those are the major factions. There are other factions as well. Like when I did the when we did the Wasteland or Fallout themed match, I did the Followers of the Apocalypse behind me, which are people that are essentially caught between all of this. They're just trying to survive in the middle of it, not being NCR or being Caesar's Legion, and trying to provide community defense and medical support for the local wastelanders. So they're not the only ones, and it's like a very broad, diverse, interesting world that's very rich, actually.
So if you really want to delve into that Fallout lore, you could dedicate like a whole year just reading about it, and you still wouldn't be done. I mean, because a lot of it is also user generated. However, in light of moving on, we talked about mission, enemy terrain, troops available, basically none for you. You're on your own because it's a survival situation. Time allotted before you die of thirst. Civilian considerations. There are sparse civilian settlements peppered around the Mojave, but don't expect for them to be. It's not a booming location per se. So, I think as far as that, I think we have covered most everything for part one of reviewing the actual scenario. Josh, Karl, do you guys have anything else that you'd like to just add to the baseline scenario?
The only thing that I think is worth mentioning here is for the viewers who may not be super familiar with the universe, I think you guys did a decent job outlining and mapping what that looks like, with the lore and whatnot all built in. However, I'm not familiar with it whatsoever, as you both know. But when I think about everything that was discussed, a lot of that stuff is probably where our minds would gravitate to in this type of a hypothetical scenario, regardless. So if you're watching and you're sort of disconnected from the video game reality that's we're using as a baseline for this, just think through the likely realities of different fractionalized society, small groups, as Karl pointed out, many people caught in between, maybe shrinking down into much smaller groups, and some of the limitations and issues that you'd be dealing with that are all built into the game because it's probably modeled not so far off of what you might actually have to deal with.
Yep. The only thing I can think of to add to this that we didn't bring about regarding the terrain here, believe it or not, a lot of people don't realize this. Food out here in the desert isn't as hard as you'd think. There's small game. A lot of the plants are edible. Mesquite flower. There's things you can harvest out here, and food is actually not your problem. Your problem's water. Water is the challenge. So that would be your biggest issue. Finding something to eat, pretty easy. Finding something to drink, pretty hard.
So, first of all, I have not spent nearly as much time as Karl has in the field. Honestly, I did not know that the desert, the Mojave, had a decent amount of food. I mean, I think that goes down to a local being familiar with your local field craft that gives you an upper edge. But to one point that Josh was talking about, and I was thinking about holding on to this thought until the very end of the video, but Josh makes a good point because Karl, you and I, we like Fallout. We put an entire theme together based off of Fallout New Vegas for this, but poor Josh had to endure our nerdy conversations on Fallout New Vegas and what's going on. I have a theory on Fallout New Vegas and the entire storyline. I think that Fallout New Vegas draws a significant amount of parallels to, in a strange world, to Afghanistan and the Operation Enduring Freedom. And that's not to say because I was ISAF or whatever, but hear me out on some of these points. Karl, you talked about how the photo that I showed from Bagram looked incredibly a lot like the terrain around you. So terrain aside, there could be many places in the world that look very similar. You're talking about an organized military force that is deployed beyond its borders, sometimes with sparse military supplies, sometimes with good military supplies. That would be the NCR, the New California Republic troops, these guys who are deployed outside of the New California Republic to deal with the opposing group, the Legion, who are a somewhat cult-like religious organization that goes around and tries to enslave people and do pretty nasty things. Now, I don't want to go into the exact details of good guy versus bad guy. If you follow the Fallout New Vegas lore, you know that it does not mean one side is good and one side is bad just based off of what they do in their MO. But I think given in our world, if we were to think of this lost world out there, where there is a foreign deployed military that had intermittent supply fighting another organization that was very closely cohesive through a religious cult-like belief system. And there were civilians all over the place. There were traitors all over the place. There are little explosive traps all over the place. There are places for people to hide, little small pockets of communities all over the place, extremely tribal. And this big overarching military was trying to tie everyone together under this one centralized location / government / rule and taxation system. I feel like there is, I would say, a 70-80% parallel between what we're seeing in, well, not right now, in Afghanistan, in Afghanistan, Operation Enduring Freedom versus Fallout New Vegas. And that's my theory. I mean, guys out there in the comment section, tell us what you think. I mean, Karl, Josh, what do you guys think about that assessment?
Well, being unfamiliar with the lore to a heightened degree, I'm probably not really qualified to give an opinion on it. But the story you've outlined, and as I've learned about it more, it does seem quite aligned. Karl?
Art imitates life and life imitates art. And I think that the reason that there's similarities there is that when there are situations of instability, these are the sorts of things that come to the surface. And whatever that instability is, obviously Afghanistan is one of the most prominent examples of it, but there are others in the world that maybe don't have the same theocratical element like Caesar's Legion. But when you look at Somalia, it's a warlord state with different feuding factions and a desert that's very much, dangerous to be in for those reasons. I think that instability breeds that sort of thing, and people ultimately, the idea of the independent individual survivor that doesn't make it without others is unrealistic. And so people band together, and you're seeing different types of philosophies in that banding together.
Okay, so right. This actually kicked off quite a few comments in the comments section just right now. We'll get to that a little later in section 4. But I want to emphasize that I'm not saying it's 100% parallel. Obviously, it's not 100% parallel. But there are certain parallels between fact and that type of fiction. That's just strange to me. And just to say, Fallout New Vegas was scripted during the early mid-era invasion into Afghanistan. I'll just throw that out there. Gentlemen, anything to add before we go to section 2 where we show exactly what our thoughts are and our picks are?
Да, принято. Контролируем автоматическое сближение.
Okay, here we are back in part 2. Part 2 where we talk about our picks and our picks on which ones we would choose. Now, usually what we do, somehow I always end up in the top rung. I think it's because I start the stream. And then our next will be Josh, who will talk about his pick. And then following him, Karl, you get to do the final pick. If Josh and I are opposing to each other, you will break that tie. Okay, so let's look at what we have on hand. On the top, we have the Mosin Nagant, well, a surplus bolt-action rifle is what we specified. Basically, a bolt-action rifle that was maybe military designed, has origins for military use. So you would assume that it had some type of design element that it was reliable enough, rugged enough, and accurate enough for military service. With a scope, so that's an added element to it, because Karl, I believe you've talked about it in the past, how even a small magnification is aiding your intelligence gathering in the wide open field. And with all intents and purposes, this is the widest open field probably that we've done on a pick one scenario, literally the desert. So we've got a somewhat reliable, well, we've got a reliable, assuming reliable, accurate, and decent rifle that has a manually operated rifle with an intelligence gathering capability that increases, assuming that it's not off zero, your accuracy on target. However, slower within close range combat, and assuming magazine capacity is less than the option 2. Now, to add to that, you also have a suppressed 22 LR pistol, which exceedingly useful when you're talking about gathering small game. But we will perhaps talk about its use, its effectiveness as an up-close defensive tool if you were to require it. It's also suppressed, so that decreases your signature to the environment around you, and that is a huge plus when it comes to concealing your location. So option 2 we're looking at is a type of Kalashnikov rifle. Really, I wrote it as any type of AKM, but I specifically put a Chinese AK here because in the Fallout franchise, because there was a Chinese invasion into the US and there was a war going on, there ended up becoming, having both US and foreign types of weapons, namely this. So if I were to choose between the two, and let me expand on some of the advantages of the AK, it's reliable enough, it's accurate enough, it covers, and Josh, you and I have shot many of AKs at distance. It is very, very capable under the 400-meter mark, which is a fairly long distance for this type of environment. Gives you a huge gap between a retreat if you require. The iron sights are very rugged and predictable. The graduated iron sights are very easily usable. And it can also be a very good tool that you use for closer range hits by using it, certain different ways. Also, you come with 27 continually fed rounds in the magazine. And I think that is a big part about this because then it covers your 0 all the way up to 400-meter target. The main crux to the AK, I would say, comes down to the ammunition. And I'm not talking about ammunition availability, but more so its susceptibility of being inoperable when you use subpar ammunition. Now, 7.6239 is the manufactured surplus rounds are fairly robust, I would say. But still, if we're talking about an environment where you're talking about unknown types of storage, and unknown time that's passed by, there are very many ifs to it. The Bi-39 does withstand a lot of those issues. Look at Africa. You see it's very well used in Africa, and despite poor storage. And between the two, I think I had a really hard time choosing between these two, and that's why I think I would err on the side of keeping it simple and running with the Kalashnikov. And I'm not saying that the other pick is bad. I prefer that simplicity when I am on a mission to where I have to hike a really long way, and I would like to have all my ammunition management to be, let's say, easily managed. And I think I'm okay. I mean, I understand that people are harder to see at distance in the field than it is on range. But I will take that risk and use my eyeballs to cover cover the main combat distance and double up using a combat weapon for a survival/hunting weapon rather than a hunting weapon for a combat weapon. So that's my pick. Josh?
Well, I mean, I think you outlined the strategic advantages and disadvantages of both systems fairly well. So without belaboring that point, and knowing full well that you and I discussed offline that there I think that this is very close to a coin flip myself, but I would be selecting the surplus bolt action with the 3.5 power optic and the suppressed 22 pistol, and acknowledging that in a direct action, any sort of direct action gunfight that might ensue out in the desert, I would probably prefer to have the AK, but leverage the fieldcraft that I hopefully have as a wastelander to avoid such conflict, utilizing the telescopic sight to better identify areas that not only potential threats that I may encounter, but also to plot my area and points of, I suppose we might call them egress and evasion of some sort in advance, being able to have some better vision of my terrain as in general, not just necessarily a threat that I may need to engage or to even PID. And then, of course, the suppressed 22 pistol, I think, is the real advantage of that kit, since it really does allow us to operate on a much lower signature, or with a much lower signature. I would say that I think that there probably are some ammunition concerns with only having 8 rounds in the bolt action. That definitely limits what we could potentially do with it. And with the potential reliability, as you mentioned, of ammunition, especially in the 22. But I would be more interested to hear Karl speak on that, since I think that there is some expertise there as we get further on. So my pick, option number 1. And so, Karl, you are indeed going to be the tiebreaker tonight.
I'm going to be the tiebreaker. You guys are making salient arguments for both of these, but one of the things that I think that we get caught up in when we have conversations of this type is that we always think of it being a combat scenario. And combat is certainly part of this 100-mile long hike, potentially, if you mess up. I was mentioning earlier in this conversation about using the terrain appropriately and the fieldcraft, and very much like what Josh was saying, was that I think that if you get into an extended combat situation with your AK or with your Mosin Nagant while moving across the Mojave or this part of the desert, you're probably already on the losing end of whatever's going on. So in that regard, my choice and my tiebreaker here is option 1, the surplus bolt action rifle with the scope and the suppressed 22 LR rifle. I don't see the pistol as being useful in a defensive role, but as I mentioned earlier, that the desert actually provides far more food than people think it does. Small game, rabbits, birds, dove, quail, which would still exist in this world, would be harvestable with that, with a relatively quiet way to do it. If you have just the AK, you don't have that option, and you need to eat to continue moving across the desert, and that would be your tool for that. If you have to use the bolt action rifle, you could hopefully have the upper hand by having the first shot fired in the conflict, using the superior accuracy, the range, the ability of the optic to give you a more precise shot, may give you the option of a critical hit, as the game refers to it, and end the fight before you have to fire your second round out of your 8. And in that regard, I think that you have a higher chance of survival by avoiding all conflict, especially in an area ravaged by Caesar's Legion and the NCR, using your fieldcraft and the environment appropriately, harvesting food to survive with your pistol that is relatively quiet, and using the advantages of the scope for observation and the round and the power therein to use it for critical hits, gives you the highest chance of survival while moving across an environment that's hostile to you in every possible other way.
But obsolescence, Karl.
They're both obsolescent. That's part of the problem. Now, what's interesting about that, and I don't know if we want to get into this later, I ran this, we ran the Wasteland Shuffle at the 2-Gun Action Challenge match, and we had 30 plus competitors choose between the Mosin Nagant or the AKM and the pistol to run the runs. And out of 30 people, I placed 3rd overall with the Mosin Nagant, even though, and the other the two that won would use the AKM, but that was simulating a combat scenario in which we were fighting for the best time possible, most hits on the clock with dynamic movement in a very rough range filled with sharp rocks and mean things. So if it got down to we have to fight, and this is a fight. Those 8 rounds of the Mosin Nagant used appropriately in this environment didn't put me down in the bottom of the scores. It put me 3rd overall out of 30 people. So I think that it's viable to use this when you're limited with the amount of ammunition you have in the AK and limited with the amount of ammunition you have in both. When you have to land less rounds on the target due to the power advantage of the gun you're using, it starts to become a wash. You can have longer distance engagements, which is in your benefit with the optical scope or optically mounted rifle and higher power cartridge. But in that regard, when you say obsolescent, they're both obsolescent. I don't see that as an advantage or disadvantage. I frankly see the optic as a huge advantage for better movement and observation, and the suppressed pistol as a survival tool more than I see either one of these being all that viable for an extended engagement. And if you were to get an engagement with either one of these with well-equipped NCR, you're going to get smoked.
So one thing one point we haven't talked about, and I actually did not see anyone in the comments section on the YouTube or Facebook side talk about either. What do you guys think about bayonets in this type of scenario? Now, obviously, both of these are military rifles, and if this were an actual Chinese-issued Type 56, which they would not be using in 2077, that's beside the point. The point is, both of these rifles are military-styled rifles and do have provisions to take a bayonet. What do you think about bayonets in this type of scenario? Do you think they are useful or no?
I don't think so. I think you're not going back to the Old West in this regard. Like Old West synergies here are huge. And if I had to have a secondary, or I should say tertiary, if I had a pistol and a rifle melee weapon, I'd want an axe or a tomahawk or something like that that would be more useful than a bayonet.
Yeah, I would actually echo that. I mean, I have zero training with ECQC hand-to-hand fighting technique, but I just feel that the intuitive nature of having, and I appreciate that a hawk can be like extremely versatile and very damaging when somebody's hands who's skilled with it. But I would imagine having some sort of detached melee weapon would be more valuable and potentially even more utilitarian as well.
So I would argue on that point. I don't know why, but we actually did get a bayonets course when I was in the military. Now, did I use it? Absolutely not. It was more. I think it was more one of those things that some officer wanted to drop it in his OER, that they did bayonet training for the new guys coming in. But I would say between these two options, the bayonet in this configuration, since the Chinese is not using the spike, would be more useful as a utilitarian knife, because this iteration of Type 56 takes a bladed bayonet that detaches, whereas the Mosin is a cruciform spike bayonet. But the Chinese obviously issued military Type 56 is a underfolding spike, much like the Type 56 SKS.
I think a spike would be quite useless, quite honestly. But a blade type bayonet that you could use as an auxiliary survival knife would be useful. But that goes back to, if you're going to have a tertiary weapon or some sort of other handheld weapon, I would rather have an axe or a tomahawk or something like that, and I wouldn't worry about it being mountable to my gun. This is one of those contentious conversations that has happened on InRange a lot. And there's actually firsthand accounts and reports going back to the U.S. Civil War. We're talking 1860s, in which the bayonet was considered pretty useless. I think that it wasn't completely useless. Of course, there were bayonet kills, but statistically speaking, even in the U.S. Civil War, the amount of wounded or killed soldiers with bayonets is like a tiny percentage. It's something it's so small it doesn't matter. And that got only worse during World War I. I think the reason we still see the bayonet around is, one, they look cool, and two, from a training perspective, I think there's something there about instilling fighting spirit. But in terms of it being actually viable weapon, I don't think it's been that for a long time.
I could not tell you from combat experience, but I remember earlier we had someone who commented on one of our videos that unless you're an infantryman, you cannot comment on infantry weapons. So I was qualified on a bayonet. So you guys are not qualified and talking about a bayonet, evidently.
No, all I can do is use historical data. And the historical data to me represents that it's not useful.
Okay, so there we are. We had, let's see, we have a 2-1 for the bolt action plus suppress 22.
Yeah, get wrecked.
Literally, it's just one other person to help you out, Josh. All right. That said, is there anything else that you guys wanted to tie into this? I mean, we could still talk about some of the minutia. I showed you guys some of the comments that we're going to talk about, but specifically to your reasoning, to your logic, to your thoughts, is there anything else you'd like to add to this?
No, let's take a look at some of the user comments.
Выдаю УППС исходная. УППС исходная. Есть загорание двух диодов, отпустил погасли. И выдаю ВПС исходная. Есть загорание двух крайних.
Okay. Sorry about that. That was a little too loud. Let's look at what the internet thinks is the best weapon. Are you guys ready? Oh.
Whoa, we win. Look at that.
Okay, so let's expand upon this a little bit because we did have a lot of comments for this one, and the voting participation was actually quite good.
Yeah, 13K votes. Right on, guys. Nice job.
A lot of people.
All right, so if we were to start mincing through some of those comments that we talked about, the first one is from Luke Marquis. In real life, with this scenario, or in the game, the 22s were useless against even a rad roach. Now, a rad roach, by the way, gentlemen, Karl, you know, is an irradiated cockroach that is the size of a football, an American football. I think that's a pretty comparable size to it. So maybe even larger than an American football. It's large. So in the game, there is a suppressed 22, and you can use it to try to, kill a giant irradiated cockroach, but it is very difficult to do that. The thing in the game the 22 was good for is if you snuck up behind someone and just click someone in the noggin, and they would just go night-night. Now, I think, obviously, I don't think Luke is really serious about this comment in saying that a 22 was useless. He's referencing to the game mechanism. But we did have a good amount of people who habitually say in every single 22 long rifle video that we make that 22 will bounce off of your skin. 22 is so useless and so weak that it will do nothing to you. And then on the other side of that, there's someone who would say, well, 22 enters your skull, bounces around, and turns your brain pretty much into lasagna, and you just collapse on the ground. Thoughts on that?
Karl, why don't you kick this off? Because I think you had you alluded to this during your assessment on which option you were going to select.
Yeah. So first of all, there's two different conversations here, right? One of them is using this tool for survivalism and harvesting of game. Probably not rad roaches, maybe rabbits or other things. So there's that benefit there. But when it comes to a defensive tool, 22, there's two things. I think people conflate two things. 22 absolutely kills. 22 is a very lethal round. In fact, 22 short was one of the first militarily used cartridges in a tiny little pistol during the U.S. Civil War. Now, we're talking about short, not even LR. And we're also seeing another analogy here between that then and now. Unless you're a complete sociopath, when you're in the Fallout universe, the apocalypse, taking any round through you is probably a bad deal, because antibiotics, infection, the things that you might die a week later from isn't a great idea. So there's still the fear of being shot. Like the idea like, oh, I'm just going to get shot, it doesn't matter because it's a 22. First of all, that's unrealistic even now in a modern day where you have proper medical care and can go to the EMT or the trauma ward and be dealt with. When you're out in the middle of the desert and you take 3 rounds of 22 into your chest, you probably have a problem. But does that stop you from continuing your attack? No. So the thing we're confusing here, I think a lot in conversation is 22 a good defensive round? No, it's not. That's not a stopping power round. Is 22 a good round for killing? Yes. And if you have skill and fieldcraft and can, as the game seemed to simulate, get up close to something and put it in its ear, 22 will do the job, as well as anything but the most crazed person, 2-legged adversary, probably is going to be concerned about getting a couple rounds into their lungs. So I don't think that it's not a deterrent. I also don't think it has a lot of stopping power, but it does have killing power.
Yep, I'd say that that's probably the perfect breakdown, is the difference between utilization of something as a defensive tool or potentially as an offensive tool under certain very specific circumstances. Obviously, Henry, I think it would be valuable for you to touch on this a bit more, but we spent a good deal of time earlier, I believe it was earlier this year, with the Beretta 22 video and doing the research on the Israeli assassination and or use of that handgun or its counterparts, and how effective it actually was and what techniques they would implement, very similar to what we've just discussed.
So yeah, that's how Karl, you broke it down is perfect. You're talking about it being an offensive or a defensive tool, right? I think with military use, it has, in the last century, probably, it is more used as an offensive tool rather than a defensive tool. And in the context of Israeli assassins during the Operation Hand of God, and when they used suppressed 22s to snuff out the targets that they were going after, they didn't just go up to them and just do a Mozambique on them. In fact, I mean, it horrified some of the authorities, because the Israelis, the Mossad agents, would unload the entire magazine into the victim. And the reason for that is because they needed to ensure that that victim had enough holes punched into them that they would finally go down. Now, did they go down? Yes. Yes, they all did. So there has to be a distinction between what the 22's role is in these types of scenarios. And also, I mean, I think part of that too comes down to training, because the agent's name who was on the flight, Mordecai Rahamim, the El Al airline agent who fended his plane off from the terrorists who were trying to take it over with Kalashnikovs and grenades. He used a 22. And that's because they were issued 22s. It's not because he chose a 22 for concealability, and because they were trying to find something with a lower interference in an aircraft, to where if they fire it, it wouldn't be like a large caliber punching larger holes in it. So when he went and shot at the terrorists who were trying to bomb the plane, he has an account where he shoots his entire entire inventory of ammunition off of him. And that's, again, from the training that the Israelis do with 22 pistols that they were issued. They offload those rounds and have to put multiple rounds into a target. And in their training, they do that to ensure that the target eats all the lead salad that they are serving them, basically.
Oh, I mean, that goes along. Go ahead, Josh.
Well, I was just going to say that one story is such an outlier. I mean, it does represent the concept that, yes, the training methodology is keep shooting. But that one story is such one of the most insane outlier examples of 22 used in a defensive scenario that the person survived in the first place. Like that whole story is one of the things that you would watch it and there could be in a movie and you wouldn't believe there's no way that this is real. But that entire story is absolutely incredible.
Yeah, you know, when you look at Fackler data and all of the stopping power data and statistics, the truth is pistols really aren't that great in general. Like, and this is where it's fire until the threat stops scenario with pistols, whether it's 9mm, 45 ACP, you know, 2 World Wars, or a 22 LR. It might take more rounds to do the job, but I don't think 22 LR is completely incapable of it. And I think we've just proven it on a couple scenarios where it could be. Now, in a pinch, in our scenario, you have all 10 of your rounds in the magazine and you give the thing all 10. It may or may not work, but 10 rounds is a lot of holes. And depending on what the adversary is it a great defensive choice? No. Is it a great offensive choice? It certainly can be.
Yeah, so you remember when we were putting together the Wasteland Shuffle, I specifically said that I wanted the end user, if they missed any of the rounds off of the bolt action, that they had to run up and unload all 10 rounds, regardless if they missed 1 round or if they missed 5 rounds onto that final target. And then, of course, their penalty would be time added for the misses. And specifically, that was intentional because with the 22, and that's basically, for me, that I insisted that because I was drawing back to some of those accounts that I had learned doing research with the Israelis. Let's see. This is another. Okay, so this one's sort of related to that first one that we talked about with suppressed 22. Obviously, so suppressed 22 is pretty much as quiet as you can get it, especially if you wet the can and then either tape it or use a wipe on the front. It's very quiet, but it's not silent like the video games. It is far from silent. Now, Karma, again, this is one of those things. Invariably, we get a lot of video game references, which I'm very happy to get because I am a huge fan of Fallout. So Karma said that if this was in the Fallout game, I'd pick the silence pistol because Bethesda makes broken stealth. Me crouching. Enemy. Huh. Must be my imagination. So in the game, you're able to, once you crouch on the top bar, it says detect, not detected, detected, or caution or danger. That's the danger bar. So part of it comes down to the idea that you would choose the 22 because you could, and this is another one that's, so part of it's that you could use a 22 and sneak up on someone and clock them and then take all their stuff without anyone around there knowing. So thoughts on this in a, not a dense location per se, but let's say in a building with someone. I mean, let's take the sneak thing aside, whether you could sneak up, that's on you. But if you break your cover and you start clicking away with your 22, I don't think it is as quiet as the video games make it. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, just really simple. We knocked this one out. Like, it's obviously not, right? Like, any of the suppression mechanics in video games are wildly overpowered in terms of their connection to reality. Karl?
We always get so focused on the actual guns and not the reality of when they're being used. And I think that's one of the things we see in this in movies, video games, all this. So let's say the 22 is as silent as the game portrays it. It makes absolutely no sound whatsoever. And you fire it inside this building against this unknowing or undetected, that you're not detected against this adversary. And let's say you even kill them with the second shot. There's a pretty good chance that when you hit them, they might do something like, I don't know, scream, gurgle, freak out, flail about, fall to the ground, knock something over. The chances of that being a silent, undetectable event is infeasible. Even if the gunfire itself isn't what gives away the fact that something happened that shouldn't have, the person being hit with the bullets is gonna do something, and that in itself would break that stealth that you're in.
Yeah, so I think there has to be a consideration outside of just the firearm, as you said. It's the utilization and the thought process on what the resulting action was after using said firearm, right? Let's see. This is one that I do think is an absolute advantage to the Kalashnikov for my choice, and I held this one back because I did want to bring up Nathan's point here that the AK, because you can monopod off the mag, and Mosins are just awful under stress. Yeah, Mosins are okay, I feel like. The problem with Mosins a lot of times in the civilian, in the surplus world, is just the quality varies drastically because you don't know where they were stored before they were surplused. So my Mosin, if you look at the video of me firing it in the Wasteland Shuffle, doesn't jam. And I also have used it enough to where I understand how the interrupter works. So I don't necessarily know if the Mosin is absolutely awful under stress. Obviously, I prefer an Accuracy International's bolt action over a Mosin Nagant. I mean, just putting it out there. I don't know if you're confused whether I prefer that or the Mosin. But I'm not saying it's the best action, but I don't know if it's the worst per se. Now, the one thing about the Kalashnikov, I do think that it is a very underutilized item that people don't use the monopod as often as they could on the Kalashnikov. And part of this, I don't want to really go way too far in detail because I know we talked about this in a separate recording where we're reviewing the Wasteland Shuffle itself. But I do think that the AK pretty much having a built-in Kalashnikov, built-in monopod is an advantage in some scenarios. Obviously, it's greater signature on the bottom, so some ways it could interfere. Thoughts on that, gents?
Yeah, I have a few. In fact, I mentioned this in the Wasteland themed video on from the two-gun match. The Mosin is not optimal. It's actually quite bad from a prone position if you're forced to use the optic, because the optic is so high that you have to get this ridiculous chin weld, and it's very hard to use prone. But I would say that any opportunity in which you can brace your gun against anything for greater support when ammunition is low and it is each hit matters, do it. Monopodding your AK is a fantastic way to do that. And the Mosin is actually much better in field conditions than it is prone on the ground when you can use it off of a window or a barricade or even offhand, which I demonstrate in the video, because then that strange optic offset actually is quite good. It's just bad in prone. One of the things I did see at the match, though, is that people need to know the weapons system they're working with. And a large amount of shooters, surprisingly, either weren't very familiar with the AK's iron sights, which made it difficult for them to understand how to get hits, or with the Mosin Nagant, when they were reloading, didn't know how to do it properly and then ran the bolt and didn't actually disengage the interrupter gear, or the interrupter, and they fired an empty chamber because they had to cycle the bolt a second time for the round to actually chamber. So I wouldn't call it awful to use under stress. Any bolt action under stress is subpar and obsolescent, at least if not obsolete. However, I would pick other bolt actions over the Mosin Nagant, but the Mosin Nagant certainly delivers the goods. And even in World War II, you saw the Germans picking up a lot of Mosin Nagant snipers and using them instead of their Kar 98s.
All right, so one other point. This is something that I think is unique to sort of unique to the Fallout game itself. It's not even, I guess, not even necessarily 100% firearms related, but I choose option 3: kill the doctor, take all his medical supplies, carry the AK as my main weapon, and the Mosin on my back. 22 for hunting small games. So the idea here is to take the person's take the good doctor's firearm, murder him, and then basically take all the supply. A ruthless option. And just us living in this world, it does not conform to our morality. Quite frankly, I try to play Fallout. I played Fallout quite a few times. Different variations of Fallout 3 and New Vegas mostly. And Josh, you could be a good guy, or you could be a bad guy, or you could be a neutral type of standing guy. There's a karma count basically on Fallout on how good or bad you are, and your reputation follows that. Every time I try to play a negative karma, a bad guy, a super villain or something, at the end of the game, I end up being somewhat good, if not, really good. That's just me. I mean, some people like to go out there and murder the entire map and, take everything out there and basically break the entire game. But just a personal note, I have trouble doing that even on the game. Especially, some of the poor old guy trying to trade stuff. I have trouble doing that type of thing.
I think this is worth talking about from the perspective of what an actual. I mean, granted, okay, we're talking about like post-apocalyptic world after nukes have dropped, right? But if we bring this back into maybe something that's a little bit more palatable to our own realities for a minute. In a scenario where you have, if we just call it like rule of law deteriorate, and you see bad stuff happening, generally the groups of people that ultimately survive are not lone wolf-esque, at least not in my mind of how, or based on examples that I've seen. It would be community-based environments, I suppose. So in areas where you band together with like-minded individuals who share your value set, and you attempt to reestablish an element of, we'll call it normalcy or societal interaction and function. And so whilst this may work, going full bad guy mode or completely throwing morals to the wind may work as a way to get all of the guns in this particular scenario, you would imagine at some point that the individual who acts along those lines is going to eventually run that to ground and get caught at some point.
I think Karl, so for the audience who are unaware, Karl's actually fairly well studied in the Old West type of history, especially the small branch type of history. I think the Old West society really echoes a lot of what Fallout New Vegas and this particular scenario is. And obviously in the Old West, you've got tales of outlaws, you've got tales of the heroes. What's your observation with, I guess, some ties to the history that we know about? I mean, what did people generally see more often in that context? This is a pretty open question on the response, Karl.
Yeah, it's super broad, right? But so we hear a lot of the stories about some of the incredible, crazy things that happened in the Old West. And the reason we hear about those stories and the reason they resonate is because they were extraordinarily rare, crazy events. The reality was the majority of people were working together because that was the only way to survive that environment. Working in a battle between you and the world, vote on the world. And so the very few sociopaths that existed, people like John Wesley Hardin, or even some of Jesse James' gang, for example, they didn't do well and didn't survive long. Those are very short careers in general. They're well known now because of the infamy they gained over a very short duration of time of being a sociopath. But by being a sociopath, not only did they ostracize themselves from the normal world, which was not like that, they also tended to ostracize themselves even from their other criminal elements they were working with. So the idea that you can be a sociopath and survive in this environment and be the lone survivor that somehow just murders everyone, that will turn on you quick. That worm's head turns around and gets you. And in this example, let's use this example. First of all, the Old West does not reflect this. Those stories are apocryphal and small and do not represent the great majority of Old West society. In fact, when you hear stories like Tombstone had a man for breakfast every day, that stuff is nonsense. The reality is those places generally had a lower crime rate than a lot of the big cities in the East. That is part of the narrative that makes it exciting and interesting. But the truth is that wasn't the reality. Did things crazy happen like John Wesley Hardin? Yes, but they were the anomaly. It'd be like going 300 years in the future and saying that Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, was the norm. False, right? So that's just not a real narrative. But in regards to this narrative, kill the doctor, take all his stuff. One, this is a person that's never walked 100 miles across the desert. They probably wouldn't make it 10 miles across the desert with all that junk. Second of all, after they took 3 rounds of 22 in their chest and needed medical support, they just killed the guy they knew that could help them. Bad idea.
So basically, this is, mass killings and stuff like that back in the Old West really wasn't a big thing. It's just that it was such a shock to the society that it turned into a story that continually was passed from generation to generation as lore, or Fallout lore almost.
Yeah, no, it totally did. It becomes lore, and then you start seeing things where, like, you'll see people, you can find people lionizing someone like John Wesley Hardin. This is a man that ostensibly killed someone for snoring, right? I mean, this is a sociopath, but because there's some glamour to the Old West and there was gunslingers and all that stuff, it turns into a different narrative. It transforms over time. But again, those are the anomalies, not the realities. You don't hear the story about the miner that lived in Tombstone, had a wife and a kid, made a living, and then eventually moved to San Francisco when he retired without ever being in a gunfight, because that was the vast majority of people that lived in those communities. Those people like Hardin or Earp or Billy the Kid or Jesse James were absolutely anomalous. And in fact, there was a thing called a two-gun man, not because of a match, but because of a cultural norm. If someone came into town with 2 pistols, they were considered a ne'er-do-well. They were probably a criminal, because everyone in the community was like, why do you have 2? I'm not trying to be anti-gun here. That's not my point. It was a cultural thing, and that was an interesting indication of someone that was looking for trouble. And so even back then, that was considered kind of gauche, and people were like, what's up with that guy? That's how much the narrative of the Old West has been corrupted to what it actually was.
So what would communities do when, let's say, a two-gun man, a bandit or someone came into their town and started doing stuff? What happened to within those communities?
Well, first of all, and this is something that we would not agree with now by any stretch, quite honestly, most of the organized communities were had far more gun laws and restrictions than we do now. That's something no one talks about. You come into a place like Tombstone or Dodge City, there was a sign right at the entrance to the town that said no firearms within city limits, and those were, in my opinion, illegal laws. The Earp ordinance number 9, I think it was on the books until the late 80s, and that was, in my opinion, an illegal law. But the reality was, when you came into town, you were supposed to surrender your weapons, either with a local, believe it or not. A lot of the bars had places where they kept them for you while you were in town. Hotels did, as did the local law enforcement. So you were expected to turn in your firearms while you were within city limits. And when someone was found carrying a gun that was not a friend with the local authorities, that was an exception, of course. But if you were not a friend with the local authorities, typically you would get beaten over the head with a gun and taken to jail.
So bottom line is the Old West small town society tends to take care of each other, basically. And defend themselves.
Community defense.
They try to fend themselves against foreign and outsiders, and they had the greater degree of caution against outsiders. It sounds like.
Oh, absolutely. If someone came into town that was not known by the community, that was perhaps a two-gun man or not, they would be. I don't know if they'd be met with concern, but someone with 2 guns or acting weirdly certainly would be. If they didn't follow the local ordinance, they would probably get beaten and taken to jail. Or there's a lot of stories about things like this where, frankly, someone that was a problem kind of went away. That's the reality of it. And people didn't want those problems within their community. And the stories you don't hear about in the Old West are things like that actually are far more interesting and common, where people like Nellie Cashman, who gave out free food and lodging to miners that were down on their luck. You don't hear about that because That's not exciting. It's not a gunfight. But that was more what those towns were like than not.
So that's actually an interesting peer into what we're talking about, trying to draw some parallel between this fictional small town, sparsely populated environment. How did some of these small towns react when, let's say, federal troops try to roll in and change things? Did any of that type of thing happen?
Well, I don't know about federal troops coming in trying to change anything. There was actually a video I just put out on InRange 2 weeks ago, was an instance in which the the federal troops came in to support one faction of a corporate oligarchy in Lincoln County during the Lincoln County War. So you had Billy the Kid and the regulators held up in a house, and this was the culmination of the battle. And then the opposition, which was called the House or the Murphy-Dolan group, was on the outside, and they were sieging the house for days. And because of corruption in the local community, the Santa Fe Ring and others, the Murphy-Dolan group called out for help. And the Fort Stanton, the military, actually came in to support one corporate faction over another. And I will say that the local community in the West was generally somewhat skeptical of the government because it frequently wasn't legitimate. It was frequently taking sides with one corruption form or another. So I'm not saying that's today or not, but back in the Old West, it's kind of a really broad statement, and of course it would vary from one situation to another. But the reality was that most people went west because they were done with the Civil War and done with a lot of like that kind of thing. And when it came into town, it was usually met with no one took up arms against them, but they were not met with open arms either. Does that make sense? It wasn't welcome.
Classic, small, tight-knit communities out in the desert. So let me
add one thing. It's a lot of live and let live kind of mindset, which you still see in the West, which is, all right, you're a weirdo doing your thing, go do your thing, just don't do anything with me with it and we'll be okay, right? Like, and that was kind of how a lot of that was. And that's not sociopathic. So someone comes into town and they just aren't the vibe, as long as they're not causing a problem, kind of left alone, as long as they, and I think that's still the case today. You didn't, even nowadays, if you walked into a town and was like, I need help, I think more often than not, you're going to find someone that's going to help you rather than shoot you and take your car, right? The Old West was no different. And I don't think the post-apocalyptic world would be different either, because you don't know what that person is or isn't. And what's the value of that? And eventually that's going to catch up with you.
So part of it, and there was a comment up there, I do want to say, we're looking at this from a very classical Western culture, though. So I don't know if this is universally applied worldwide, but the game was set in a classically Western society, Fallout New Vegas. You are situated, Karl, you are situated in a classically Western society. So classically Western morals apply to this. And I think this is the narrative that really kind of draws a standard between both of these parallels that we're talking about there.
Yeah, I agree.
So one thing, it wasn't reflected in some of the comments, but it's something that I personally had a question on, and I know. So Karl, you've got a lot of time with Old West stuff, as we've talked about. 22 long rifle. In this particular instance, of course, we've got a 22 suppressed 22 pistol. This whole scenario is a very logistically based scenario. What can you find? What ammunition do you have before you say, I'm going to pick this weapon and find the ammo for it? I think you said it earlier, it's more so, what ammo do I have? Okay, I'm going to get the weapon that shoots that ammo, right?
Yeah,
so
I think you're way more worried about the ammo. You're like, if you find a bag of ammo, you're like, sweet, now where do I find the gun that works with this? Trying to have the gun and find the ammo is a much more difficult proposition.
So that is an interesting thing about this because with 22 long rifle, yes, it is plentiful in numbers, but 22 has a reputation of being unreliable, susceptible to the elements. 22 also, let's say, I mean, because it's not center fired, the primers, let's see, and I'm loading a video from Ranger Dave who had some issues firing his 22 during the Wasteland Shuffle, but the rimfire type of ignition, especially back then, in the cowboy in the Old West days, were that at one point the rimfire cartridge was a standard for the metallic cartridge, right? So 22 long rifles, let's say range pickups, stuff that you just find in a corner on the side of rocks that's been out in the desert for decades. How viable is the rimfire type of cartridge really for a long-term use in the desert, being in unknown environments? Because in this particular instance, and I'll show you in a bit, Ranger Dave had issues with his 22 because I think he got it wet or something. Thoughts on that, Karl, with the reliability of rimfire?
Well, first of all, yes, when you're talking about like the use of rimfire in the Old West, you're talking about 22, which did exist then, but more commonly 44 Henry rimfire, which was used in pistols, the 1860 Henry, as well as the 1866 Winchester and other things. One of the things they did in the Winchester to help mitigate that issue was they actually had two firing pins. And so it would actually strike two ends of the rim on one rimfire cartridge to help improve the detonation. Another thing that you'll see in there's actually forensic data of this from the Battle of Little Bighorn or the Greasy Grass, in which a round didn't go off and you just open the action, turn the cartridge, close the action, and try it again because you're hitting a different part of the rim. So is rimfire ammunition the most reliable? No, there's a reason we got away from rimfire and went to centerfire. Is it as unreliable as people say it is? I don't think that's true. Like with Ranger Dave here, if he had the chance to turn the cartridge and try it again, it might have worked, right? It's all about the priming compound and the consistency of its application amongst the ring for it to fire. But one thing we did back in a two-gun match many years ago, we had a match that was themed around zombie wars, and there was a really cool stage in which we used a Ruger 22 with no magazine and had a can about this big. A friend of mine who's a firearms forensic guy had been picking up 22 discards off the range for like a decade, no joke. And he had this can of some of it with verdigris on it, some of it corroded, some of it not, random dog's lunch of 22, like a coffee can full. And what we did is at the match, we provided each person that coffee can and this gun, and they had a time limit of how many of the targets could they neutralize, single loading one round into the gun at a time. And some of it didn't go off, absolutely. Some of it went off with a secondary strike if you turned it and fired it again. But what I was really surprised about was how much of it did go off. Like, I would say, I don't have exact numbers, but I would say out of that coffee can of thrashed ammo, easily an 80% success rate, if not higher. So it's not as bad as I think people think. And actually, the desert's one of the better places for it to be preserved, because what's going to mess up the priming compound in 22LR is going to be humidity and moisture, something we don't have a lot of here in general. So if it's kept in a dry, hot spot, I bet you a lot of that 22 is going to work.
That's interesting to talk about because Ranger Dave is he's located in Virginia. I think I need to talk to him afterwards what happened. But if you've lived on the eastern seaboard, Virginia is a wet location. So, gents, on that, is there anything else you guys want to talk about as far as the actual scenario, comments that you saw that you'd like to review? Or if not, we have part 4 where we would open the forum to anybody out there to talk about, to ask us questions.
Yeah, let's field some questions.
I agree. Karl? Let's do that.
All right.
Good. Let's do it.
Деталь погасли, рут влево, есть догорание двух крайних светодиодов, в центре не горят, нейтраль погасла. Выдаю. Рус. На торможение.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, are we still? Yes, we're still on. And so we are now open for any questions from the audience. Feel free to drop your questions into the chat. We can monitor both the podcast, or we can monitor all three sources, the podcast channel, the usual 9-hole reviews channel, and we could also field questions from the Facebook side. If you guys are unfamiliar, we did start a podcast channel that we use to clip together some of the smaller micro content that comes from these events. So go check it out, 9H Podcasts. Anyways, gents, do you see anything in the comments section that I should punch out? Let's see.
What was the round count for the AK in this scenario from 50? I think we said 27, so just under a mag.
Yep, correct. It's 27. Okay, so this is from Stranger Omen. Would you change your choice if we change the options slightly? So I guess essentially, what would tip you to the other side to choose the other item?
I think if the Kalash platform had some type of a prism sight with it, I would be much more inclined to lean towards that. I do think that, basically we broke down, at least for me, my decision came down to the advantages of the telescopic sight and the suppressed 22. So if we could, basically counter out one of those advantages, then I could potentially make that shift.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. I think the optic would be a huge difference. I'm still kind of tied up on the idea of having the very quiet pistol for a survival tool, though. That's the harder one for me, because I think that more again and again, this is less about the fight. You don't want the fight. It's more about getting across those 100 miles of desert terrain without the fight.
See, for me, I mean, first of all, that really I was fine with either of those options. But when it came to the bolt action, if I had more ammunition to come with a bolt action, I would be a lot more comfortable with that. That said, though, the bolt action itself, it being a manually cycled action, you don't have to deal with different pressure variations of cartridges. You could even, in a pinch, if it's worst case scenario and you were able to prime a cartridge somehow, you could even load it with black powder and stick some type of a 30 cal projectile in it. It won't shoot at the same point of contact, point of aim. Probably you're shooting at, like a 20, 50 meter target at that point, but still it could function. Whereas your semi-auto would at that point with, let's say, ammunition. If you deal with any hand loaders are finicky if they screw with the types of powder, if they screw with the types of projectile, and load that into a semi-automatic rifle. Semi-automatic rifles depend on a specific specification of a cartridge to reliably operate. So I think that would be one thing with the bolt action that has it going for it. If it even had more rounds, I would say the bolt action would be even more attractive in that aspect, outside of the robust nature of it.
There is no doubt that you could use salvaged ammunition that does not work for the gun that you have with a bolt action, take components of it, and probably make something fireable. That would not be so much the case with the AKM.
So this is a comment that I saw a couple people ask. Why AK? Why not an AR-15 or a FAL? Quite frankly, it's not why not that. That's just one of the options we put up there. Thoughts on that, gents? You have a.
It's the same question we get when I would just I would take both of the options, or like, you know, it's we're specifically engaging in a attempt to think critically about a scenario with a given set of circumstances.
This is one that's interesting. A suppressed lever gun, assuming it works. We've recently done a lot of work on lever action rifles, and Karl, I think you and I had some conversation on this as well, because I mean, Josh, you know my amount of frustration with the Russian contract 1895 that we dealt with. Now, lever actions with a tube-fed mechanism, on paper, right? A lever action seems like it's faster than a bolt action. It seems like it should be great because you're not dependent on, you don't need a stripper clip, and you have a higher capacity that it loads with. It seems like a really good idea, but then at the same time, when you actually put it into practice, it's more difficult to cam open. So if you have questionable ammunition, it does not feed and extract as easily as the bolt action rifle. And I would dare say, even compared to, let's say, if you had a semi-auto, a Kalashnikov with a tapered cartridge of the 7.6239, I think that it would be easier to kickstart a semi-auto. I don't know if you know what I mean, but you know, like put the butt of the stock on the ground and kick the charging handle to where it manually extracts the cartridge. I think I would prefer that to than trying to pull a lever action open with questionable ammunition. And I mean, lever actions were great with the technology of the day when they were deployed. But Karl, correct me if I'm wrong. I don't think lever actions were used actually for that long in the span of time that we implemented. Basically, as soon as a bolt action came about, it was obsolete.
Well, you're talking about a couple different possible scenarios. The reality is, and this is one of the things that comes up because I've done a lot of bolt action stuff on InRange, is, lever gun. I stand by a statement that is controversial. Lever guns became a bad idea post the 1873 Winchester. The 1873 Winchester, in its toggle link action, high capacity, pistol caliber chambering, particularly in 4440 or 3840, which is a bottleneck cartridge which aids in extraction and deals with fouling, is a fast, quick, reliable, very easy to use, low recoil assault rifle of its day out to 200 yards. The minute they tried to turn the lever gun, into something that was firing full power cartridges, problems started ensuing. You start seeing the 1876 and then 1886, 1892, the Russian contract with 54R. Those, in my opinion, are all universally a bad idea. The lever gun had its niche and its application in the 73 toggle link, chambered in 4440 or 3840, which is a pretty fabulous weapon system with a great cartridge, as long as you use it within its paradigm and within its constraints. So I think the lever gun is a multi-tiered conversation. There's the pistol caliber variant of the 73, and then everything after it. And everything after it, I do agree with you. The 73, I still think, would have been an interesting, viable discussion.
So this is an interesting, let's see. This, I do want to just make a quick comment. Karl actually talked about this earlier, that getting, your wounds going septic in the middle of the wastelands after getting shot and not dying is potentially the bigger threat to life than is a gunshot wound immediately. So that's something that we talked about earlier. Is there anything you want to expand on that?
One thing that popped in my brain when I see this, if you have the patience to wait for them to die in septic shock or a collapsed lung, I did mention that earlier, but from example, depending on what the scenario is, we see this even in the natural world. There are certain venomous creatures that walk up, bite, then bail, and then follow the thing they bit until it dies. You could do that with a 22 if you could somehow land the shot and wait. That's not crazy.
This is an interesting one, and perhaps you can answer to this, because I know you shoot a lot of corrosive ammunition out in the desert. Now, Josh and I are in Houston, Humidity is every single part of our everyday life. It's horrid out here in the southeast Gulf Coast. You live in Arizona, which is extremely arid. Corrosive ammunition, does it affect your firearms when you fire corrosive ammunition as much as it affects ours? I.e., do you have to clean it as quickly as we do? Does it rust up as quickly for you as it does for us?
The duration of time in which you will have a ruined bore is longer, but not long enough to make a difference. So like probably in your area, when you fire corrosive ammunition or black powder for that matter, you probably need to clean it within a couple hours, right? Am I going to go ahead and that's about fair? Here, you could get away with a day, but if you leave it more than a day, you're going to have a problem. So it doesn't make enough of a difference that I think you can worry that you can ignore it.
Okay, so this is actually a pretty. Hold on, this is actually a pretty good one that I think is interesting. We talked about this from a different our different recording. The challenge says bolt action, but some further details say Mosin. So we're not locking it down to the Mosin itself. We're just saying a surplus rifle. However, there are very many different types of surplus rifles out there that we could talk about. What would, I guess, if I were to ask you guys, since you two chose the bolt action /22, what would be your choice when it comes to a surplus /civilian bolt gun for this type of scenario? If you got to choose, obviously you don't, but if you got to.
I mean, are we saying it has to be surplus, or you just threw out civilian bolt gun?
Civilian. This is a civilian environment, so surplus is in a civilian environment. Anything available in the civilian environment.
Well, for me, that would switch to a modern bolt gun with a lightweight synthetic chassis of some sort that is going to allow me to shave the weight and be better fitted to my person. Karl?
If you could raid a ruined Walmart and pick up the $198 Winchester Special with the garbage scope on it, it'd be better than the Mosin Nagant. In any cartridge, pick one. 243, 308, 65, doesn't matter. Any one of those $250, $300 mass-produced hunting guns that are sold like in those kind of stores is better than the Mosin Nagant.
So I feel bad. I mean, we have a lot of people who submitted stuff, but I keep on pulling Ranger Dave's thing out. But one thing I did want to talk about. So Ranger Dave decided to shoot the Fallout, the Wasteland Shuffle, when you get up to it, with a Carcano M95 straight pull action. In my opinion, for this particular challenge, I think the Carcano M95 straight pull is perhaps not the best choice moving forward. And to expand on that, the Carcano uses an en bloc 5-round magazine to where you load it into the rifle, and you cannot top it off until you finish loading the last cartridge in, and your little stripper clip falls out the base. And I think one of the reasons why I don't think it was a very good option is because specifically for this challenge, it would be more efficient to top it off between one of the runs. But in an actual scenario, that has application. Say like if you're fighting with a bolt gun, right, and you see cover, with ammunition management, you want to make sure that you top that rifle off. So I think that itself could pose some issues for some rifles. Now, one of the other shooters, I forgot his name, but he shot the entire match with a K31, and he actually ended up with the fastest time on the course. So at what point, I mean, do you guys think straight pull versus bolt gun, would that make any difference for you?
I mean, I would say if it's still a question of like, would I take a modern rack gun versus a surplus straight pull, I would still take a modern rack gun. But if I had to choose between a say the K31 and the Mosin, I would probably take the K31.
Yeah, I'm going to second that. The Mosin is here's the reality. None of these surplus bolt action rifles perform nearly as well as just a standard cheap commercial bolt gun. Like, there's a lot of allure. They're cool. There's some neatness to it. They're military guns, but I can't think of what bolt action rifle you could. I use Walmart as an example, that you could buy at Walmart that wouldn't perform better. Like, they all will. They just will. So there's no reason to use these surplus things unless you like the allure of what they are. In terms of a Mosin Nagant versus a straight pull K31, yeah, the K31 is it's just a better rifle in general. It's a superior. It's made to higher qualities, in my opinion, and it's a more accurate gun in general. But I don't think straight pull versus bolt action matters that much. If you put a really good high end or higher end military bolt action rifle up against the K31, it's a wash. The Mosin Nagant's kind of on the kludgier end of things, but the truth is none of them keep up with a $300 special from Walmart.
Okay, so this is one that is one firearm category that we did not have in this scenario, of course, the shotgun. I think the closest to a modern equivalent of a blunderbuss. I mean, not exactly close enough, because you can, with a shotgun, if you get the brass hulls, you can actually pop out the primer and field load it with whatever trash you have into the shotgun. Technically, you could, right? So what do you guys think? I actually think a solid 12 gauge would not be a bad option in that instance with a as long as you assume that you could get primers. I think that is going to be your biggest issue, whether you can get the cartridges or the primers. Thoughts on that?
Let's go back to the Old West again on this one. You know what the most common, most viable, most useful survival gun was? A shotgun. And the reason for that is the same reason smoothbores were frequently still used even in the age of rifled muskets. They can do a variety of things that you can't do otherwise. You can still fire a round ball. You can fire a buck and ball. You can fire random trash. That's still the reality of a shotgun. Even if you go with a 12 gauge pump gun, like you said, easier to reload the cartridge holes. You can put kind of anything you really need to in it and fire it, as long as you can find primers and powder. And there are advantages to smooth bore barrels that I think we overlook nowadays when it comes to survival scenarios, and the shotgun still lends itself to that.
So, Karl, back in the day, back in the day, I would imagine in the Old West, it was not as easy to get cartridges out there to the frontier. Outside of, even if you're talking about cap and ball, there's still a cap. That's still a primer. How did people solve that problem logistically of getting primers to the frontier, like a frontier's general store? How did that happen?
Yeah, well, it did happen. The reality is but it wasn't like nowadays. You didn't buy it. A lot of this stuff was not bought for like shooting pleasure. You didn't buy a tin of percussion caps to have fun with and go practice with. You bought it because it was essential, and you only fired when you absolutely thought you could or had or needed to. So, but in terms of getting them, got to remember, like, we're talking about what years are we talking about? 1860s, 1870s, 1880s. Some of these towns were well supplied or resupplied enough that not only did they get a reasonable amount of powder and ball and ammunition, some of these towns had oysters. You could actually go to the restaurant and eat oysters. So if they could bring oysters to town, they could bring percussion caps. They just weren't something that were used. They were a expensive and prized commodity, and you would buy however much you thought you would need for your trip and take good care of it.
Are you guys seeing any comments? I'm trying to scan through as much as possible.
Just one other that I've seen asked a few times, which I thought was kind of cool, was from Nuke, and it says, when out of ammo for all three options, not sure what the third, maybe the reference to the shotgun, which loadout still offers the most utility? Thinking about even breaking them down for things like springs and parts and so on.
Here you go. So, okay. So basically, if you were to entirely disassemble it and use it for, I mean, first of all, I think a rifle is a pretty bad club. If you need a club is a better club than a rifle. That's my opinion. It's kind of like what we talked about before. A bayonet stuck at the end of a rifle as a spear is not as good as an actual spear. Whatever that is. However, I guess if in my opinion, I don't know about you, Karl, I don't know how people did in back in the West. If you were limited on supply, I feel like the longer one, the longer one has more material, so there's more stuff to cut off if you need to.
Yes. I mean, yeah, I don't know. I don't know that I see much of a difference here. I guess, you know what? I'll go with this. The one with wood on it, because eventually you can burn it for heat and fire. I mean, like literally, like that sounds ridiculous, but if you're not going to get ammo, you've got a stock that's got wood on it. Take the stock off, and at least you can create a fire with it if you're out of firewood or something. I mean, we're getting to the point of like if you're stripping springs and using the stock for warmth by burning it,
things are bad.
Yeah, this is a bad day. Yeah,
I would say that I think the optic is exceptionally valuable. That can be ripped, right? Like we could rip the optic and use it as a monocular if we needed to.
I agree with that 100%. That you just answered the question. That's the right answer. The answer is the one with the glass, because you keep the glass.
Let's see.
So Henry, we just closed in on about the 2-hour mark. Are there any other ones you wanted to cover off?
I don't know, Karl, what are your thoughts?
No, beyond that, you wanted me to tell the story about the car battery at some point.
Oh, yes.
Oh, yes. I mean, let me. I'm just gonna find a random one and then go. There we go. Okay, Karl. So tell us about wasteland living. How is real life feel when you live in the wasteland IRL?
The desert's more like this than a lot of people think that don't. First of all, even people that live here that don't go off into the desert wouldn't necessarily see all this. But when you go out into the desert, you find weird stuff, a lot of weird stuff. Like it's part of the thing. It just is. You find ruins, you find stuff left behind, you find vehicles that have been abandoned or burned or shot up for fun or sometimes for criminal reasons. But and so in that regard, there's a lot of stuff. You go out in the desert, you're like, huh, neat. And I've got a lot of weird things that I found just out in the desert. But one of the more interesting stories about that was at one of the places that I go to film and sometimes shoot at. I drove by this abandoned car that had been out there for like weeks. And at some point it gets reported to the local law enforcement, and hopefully it's not a stolen vehicle or something horrible happened. A lot of times people just ditch it. Like I have found ditched cars. I have found completely dropped like cattle. I found people leaving their horses behind, all of which, like if it was a survival scenario, that's free meat, right? That stuff's just out here. You just find it. This stuff happens to me regularly. So there was this car out here that had been left there. It had been partially shot up, partially burned, but not entirely. And I was looking at it, and my Volkswagen needed a new battery because the battery had gone bad from the heat and sun. And after that car had been out there long enough, I looked at the battery. I'm like, battery looks good. And I tested it, and it came up with a charge. So stripped the battery out, and that's the battery now in my Volkswagen today. Literally using salvage junk out of a ruined, shot up car in the desert is now the battery in one of my vehicles. So that's a real thing. And you can do that even in the desert now.
You hear about this story all the time. Have you found any ammunition or firearms that are, and I would expand on this, wrapped up in something and buried in the ground? Because you hear about that all the time, by that crooked tree down 300 yards by the rock that looks like a moon face.
No, I haven't. I mean, I have found things that are like improvised weapons. Like I found shanks or like axes with taped up handles and stuff like that. In fact, I have a picture of west of the I-10 is a known kind of weirdly sometimes dangerous area for all sorts of reasons. And many years ago, I found a truck out there that had been ditched, and I don't know what the story was. I reported this one, but there was an axe literally in the windshield, like smashed through the windshield, just left out there in the desert. So there's an abandoned truck. There was no blood, but there was an axe through the windshield, and I have a picture of that. And that kind of stuff happens. So I found axes and knives and stuff like that, but I've never found a gun.
I think someone made this point too. You also found an Ian McCollum out in the desert.
Yeah, those just wander around randomly. They're really rare, but you can occasionally net one and use it for other purposes. So yeah, that happens.
Okay, so I think at this point, gentlemen, is there anything else that you guys would like to add? I think we've kind of discussed this pretty thoroughly. We could discuss this for another 5 hours. I feel like this is an interesting toss-up between two choices. So, any thoughts?
My only final thought was, Karl, thank you very much for stepping on and participating in this with us. It was a lot of fun. The Old West history I found exceptionally interesting as part of this entire discussion, and I really didn't expect us to go there. So I enjoyed that quite a bit.
Well, I'd like to thank you both for having me, and thank you for that. And I appreciate that. That's one of those topics I do deal with on my channel quite a bit, and it's funny that I think it's really more fascinating than most people like. Kind of like what you just said. The more you dig into it, the more really interesting it is, and how much it actually represents, or is how much it actually influences our modern day still to today. In many ways, it does, and at least culturally, at least parts of our country, but as well as it reflects interesting scenarios that we do mental exercises about, but don't, like, if you look back to the past, it wasn't that long ago that people were dealing with these types of issues and living them. And I think the reason Fallout is compelling is because it's well-written science fiction. And it's, again, I mentioned this earlier, is like art emulating life or life emulating art. And you can't really tell the difference, right? And so stories from then and stories from today, and that story that really is, I would say Fallout kind of is a Western, right? I mean, in many ways. The lessons learned are still real. In fact, that's one of the interesting about when you look back and you go back to gunfights from the Old West, the stuff learned fighting with guns in 1870 still apply to today. Just the fact that we have semi-automatic weapons and other things doesn't make a dang bit of difference. The same exact rules applied in terms of winning, or, well, is never guaranteed, but the same gunfighting rules applied then that do now.
Agreed. So, Karl, just for, obviously, you've got the InRange tag on your name, but for those who may be nine-hole viewers and unfamiliar with your work at this point, although unlikely, why don't you give a quick shout out for anybody who's interested in learning more about any of these bits that you've brought here tonight?
Cool. Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. And so I would imagine that our viewership has got a lot of crossover because cool, intelligent firearms content, right? But the InRange has been around 6 years, 7, something like that. I don't even remember anymore. It is, you can find it, you can find my website at inrange.tv. One of the things one of the things InRange has been somewhat a little bit unique about is that it's, I deal with a lot of different topics. It's not just firearms. It's more like firearms history, culture, convergence channel. So there's a lot of stuff that, like, for example, the Old West lessons we talked about here are relevant to firearms discussions today, and that's a lot of what's on the channel. I do a lot of work with what I call intentionally induced amnesia around history, stories that are part of the American historical experience that are, like, not generally well known and frequently deal with firearms. Sometimes some digital rights, and one of the things that's one of the biggest struggles on InRange is proactively demonetized, so completely crowd-funded, no monetization, no commercials, no sponsors, no money from YouTube, whether you're a YouTube Red or not, Patreon only. And I'm very thankful for a part of the community that's been keeping this channel alive via that mechanism alone. So that has turned into a digital battle in and of itself, because not being monetized and being on YouTube, it is an interesting fight against the media oligarchy of the internet, which is a whole nother conversation. But thank you for giving me the chance to bring that out there. You can find InRange TV by just Googling InRange TV, or go to inrange.tv, and it'll get you to all the different distribution points. I've tried to decentralize not just YouTube, BitChute, YouTube, Facebook, everywhere. So trying to not let one corporate engine kill the message. I don't know how to put that anyway, but thank you, Henry and Josh, for having me here and having this really interesting conversation. But even though it's ostensibly a video game we're talking about, it really touches on all of the survival stuff, and the old West and the new West and the current day, and maybe what happens in the future. These questions, they all align real well.
Yeah, again, I mean, thanks for your participation. And customarily, let me back up for a bit. We do have another part that we filmed, I'm working on right now, where we are reviewing the Wasteland Shuffle. So that is coming up. I'm working on it. It has been filmed. It has been recorded between the three of us, talking about the actual mechanics of the Wasteland Shuffle and what we saw. So customarily for our show, at the end of pick one, if we have another pick one scheduled, we try to show what it is. So, ladies and gentlemen, shoot, I shouldn't. Okay, so the next pick one was supposed to be taking place in Afghanistan, and actually we talked about this with I think it was like 2-3 weeks ago, Josh, that we talked about this.
It was going back even before that, Henry. It was a couple months back, and it was well prior to any of the events that have transpired over the last 2 weeks.
Mm-hmm. So initially we were supposed to do an Afghanistan Escape from the Embassy 2.0, except this time with all U.S. weapons and U.S. items and everything. And started the conversation earlier, I'd say earlier this last month. Talked to some of our buddies in the SOCOM community who were interested in talking about what's going on. And if there were a hypothetical exfil of the embassy in a pick one scenario.
Look, I mean, I'll just say it, what needs to be said here. Like, reality happened way too quick.
Yeah, and regrettably, we have to push that one back because we talked to our friends over in Special Operations community, and obviously we don't want to jeopardize any current operations that are ongoing. And so we had another pick one that actually we had also been talking about on Parallel with Marty Morgan. You guys know him from the previous pick one with Mike, aka Bloke on the Range, where we talked about the M16 versus the SLR in the Falklands. So this upcoming one, we'll be talking about a base defense scenario with the M16 series rifles versus the US M14 series rifles. So that should be happening in the next, month or two, if we could help it, Josh?
Yep, somewhere in the next month if we can make it,
The cool
stars
thing
align.
So the cool thing about this is Marty's dad is a Vietnam vet. He actually deployed to Vietnam during the Tet Offensive, right before the Tet Offensive, and it ended up responding to a base defense scenario. And he was issued one of these two weapons. And one of these two weapons shown here is actually a photograph of Marty's weapon. So there's going to be a lot of him recalling to what happened with his father, what happened on ground, and we're looking forward to seeing everybody in the next pick one scenario. Again, go ahead.
No, until then.
Yep. Thank you guys all for tuning in. It's been a lot of fun, and as usual, we went way over. So take care, everyone. Have a great weekend.
Several
716, this is Steel 96, 4 Vic, 8 packs, Redcon 1, green to green. How copy, over?
Steel 96, this is 716, roger, over. 16, Steel 91, 1 pack,